They have become a college football mainstay, and most prognosticators believe that will maintain here in 2018. We bring Ryan Cantor from Shaking the Southland to talk Clemson football, and we most focus on this conversation on wide receivers, tight ends, and running backs. So, Ryan, how you doing today?
Good. Thanks for having me on this great Memorial Day.
Definitely. And, yeah, we can't say enough about the holiday and those brave men and women who have paid the ultimate sacrifice. We will be monitoring the chat, so bring your comments, questions, and your suggestions as we roll through. But wide receivers, tight ends, running backs, the focus. But, Ryan, before we get to that, for a team that's stockpiled with talent and in some areas could boast the best talent in the country, there is a potential issue based on some scholarship situations that leaves you a little bit depleted to start the season compared to some of your rivals.
Yeah, it's just a weird situation, and I don't want to sound overly negative, so let me start by giving some credit to the coaching staff at Clemson. You know, the Tigers, they're one of their big marketing pushes, and it's real and it's genuine, is the Clemson family, and part of that is not running kids off after giving them a committable scholarship. And we saw this, I think, this past cycle at Georgia, where I also graduated. Athens is a great place, but there was a defensive end, Larell Murchison, who committed to Georgia, and then the day before signing day, they told him, "Hey, we gave out too many offers. You can't come here." And so he had, a fate worse than death. He had to go to NC State last minute. So that's what we work so hard to avoid doing. Now the problem is you have to project, and if you're going to project conservatively, that's great. But you have to project how many kids are going to go pro early, how many kids are going to transfer, and then how many are graduating, and also how many kids are going to commit when you give an offer. And this happened to be kind of a back-to-back where we were conservative on scholarships, giving out fewer than or getting fewer than 20 commits in consecutive classes, and we had a lot of kids transfer. Some of them probably more obvious: Shadell Bell, C.J. Fuller, Tucker Israel, Zarek Cooper, probably obvious, but they obviously underestimated the total number. There was 8 transfers, including Hunter Johnson, Jabril Robinson, Sterling Johnson, and Amir Trapp. And I don't know that they projected that. So with so few guys, or so many guys leaving, such small classes coming in, Clemson will have 28 actual scholarship recruits on the roster this year, which is not devastating, but they're awfully thin at cornerback and defensive back in general. AJ Terrell, Mark Fields, and Trayvon Mullen are outstanding. That's a great first 3. But beyond that, you're looking at freshmen, redshirt freshmen. They had injuries there last year. If they have injuries there this year, I don't know. Ray McLeod's gone now, so maybe they have to move Cornell Powell over in a desperate situation. They just don't have depth there. And then next year, that situation kind of moves over to defensive tackle, where you have 3 seniors at defensive tackle this year who are outstanding. But they're all gone after this year. So you're really hoping that you really need Jordan Williams, Darnell Jeffries, and Alice Pinkney to be fantastic. They all need to develop. Otherwise, you're relying on freshmen for major snaps next year. So this year, the problem could be DBs, especially cornerbacks. Next year, it could shift over to the defensive tackles. I applaud them for being conservative. Didn't work out this year, but we'll see how it pans out. They just need to stay healthy.
MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football, covering Clemson with Ryan Cantor from Shaking the Southland. Join him and the rest of the staff for the very best in Clemson athletics. How's the baseball team doing right now?
We go into regionals, get announced here today on Memorial Day. We're a host, but we don't know if we have a super, and we don't know who's in it. So it'll be exciting. Start NCAA tournaments this weekend.
And, of course, we talk college football here with Clemson, one of the elite programs in the nation. Speaking of Larell Murchison, just curious about his status going from Georgia to NC State and being left out of the scholarship numbers there in Athens. We're talking about the number 1 rated prospect coming out of North Carolina. So this was no 2-star running around looking for a job at the end of a roster. He should be a primary player for the Wolfpack, who was rated the 10th rated strong side defensive end in his class, according to 247's composite. And I know that the fate is worse than death, but it's not necessarily North Carolina A&T. But to a Clemson fan in the same division, just hope that this guy's not chasing down Kelly Bryant at some point this season or next.
In all seriousness, NC State has a really good history with along the defensive line, particularly defensive end. But could he have found a bigger program that he might have been more interested in if Georgia hadn't got him to commit and then not look at other offers? Maybe so. Maybe he's somewhere else. That's not fair to him. So kudos to Clemson for avoiding that. It's just a shame that we were overly conservative and now have a smaller roster than we could.
Yeah, he's rated number 112, regardless of position, and most of those guys land at the type of schools that NC State being more of a top 25 to 35 program. Most of these guys, if you check out any of the listings of top 100 players, they're mostly going to the elite schools. Point taken, definitely there. Talking Clemson football, running down the wide receivers, tight ends, and running backs in particular, but taking your comments and questions along the way. Jeff Scott's position group there at wide receiver, one of the elite in college football year to year. It's been established here over the last 6 to 8 years in particular. But looking back, especially the guys that line up wide, not necessarily proven production coming back for the most part, with Deon Cain and Ray McCloud taking 107 receptions from the production totals.
Yeah, and maybe I'm overly optimistic here, but I think this is a position group that, despite losing 2 guys to the NFL draft, could actually improve. So Deon Cain, Ray McCloud both went to the NFL this year. In the 9 position, T. Higgins is listed as the starter with Trevion Thompson. So Trevion Thompson is a redshirt senior. Last year, he's over his 3 years, he's only had 115 yards, 108 yards, and 94 yards each of the last 3 years. So he hasn't been an impact player, but every time we see him, he looks good. He's going to get an opportunity this year to make good on this commitment. He's been at Clemson for a long time. He's one of those guys where you appreciate the patience. You really want to see him do well. The other guy's T. Higgins at 9 wide receiver, which is kind of the taller jump ball kind of wide receiver slot at Clemson. T. Higgins is only a sophomore, but he really started to emerge last year, and he's kind of a breakout candidate type player, just incredible talent. So those two are kind of your elder statesmen and your up-and-comer there. And then behind them is Deandre Overton, who's is a junior and is another really talented player that hasn't really had his chance to shine yet. So those guys are going to get more snaps than they have in the past. I think they'll make a big impact. At the 2 position, which is where Ray McCloud was, the 9 is where Deon Cain played. Amar'e Rogers was a freshman last year, had 123 receiving yards, looks for an expanded role. He's a really tough Artavis Scott type guy, as Clemson fans remember, plucky and shifty, but also really strong. He's a guy that I think Clemson fans are excited to see. And then Cornell Powell and freshman number 1 player from South Carolina, Darian Kendrick, are behind him. And then, of course, you have Hunter Renfro in the slot. And Hunter Renfro is a senior now, and he's the leading pass catcher as far as, I guess, yards and receptions that returns. So big-time player. Clemson will certainly rely on him.
T. Higgins, the guy that impressed me when I saw Clemson play 5 or 6 times last year, a guy that I just see as a difference maker in the future, and certainly lit up defenses at about 20 yards per reception and 2 touchdowns. So you mentioned Hunter Renfro. I've got to think, after a 60-catch season, and we don't need more accolades from him when it comes to big game achievements, but just looking at the raw numbers, 60 catches last year for 602 yards and 3 touchdowns, that bring his totals to 137 receptions for his career. I've got to think that that's rising high on Clemson's all-time lists. And Amar'e Rogers, a sophomore, as you mentioned, Deandre Overton, a lot of names there vying for positions without many proven guys coming back that really threw up the 50 to 70 catch type season. So we know that there's plenty of talent there. It's just how guys are going to compete and how many guys they would like to play and how many guys are going to stay on the field over and over and over. Yeah, Ryan Cantor is on the line from Shaking the Southland. You can join him and the rest of the staff there covering Clemson sports. Of course, we're talking college football here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, where we've got a voice. Of course, we bring on the best bloggers, broadcasters, and writers in the industry with their voice, and we catch your voice on the chat and pass along those comments and questions. And here's one, Ryan, I'm not going to nail you to the wall on, although people would like to, because this is always the big question. But just your thoughts on the quarterback battle and Trevor Lawrence's possibilities of making it a true battle in August.
Well, I think the Hunter Johnson transfer is a statement about that. I was more I was leaning towards Kelly Bryant, and I still think Kelly Bryant will start game one. But it seemed like the coaches prefer the safe, reliable, and frankly solid Kelly Bryant. But the fact that Hunter Johnson, who's very good, was so clearly beaten, or at least felt the need to transfer, that he wasn't going to start this year or next year, says something about Trevor Lawrence. I tend to think it's going to be. I don't think that Trevor Lawrence is simply going to ride the bench. I think he's going to get significant snaps. I think it's going to be kind of a dual QB situation. What I think of is the year that Texas, they ended up not being good this year, but they had that amazing game with Notre Dame. They had Swoops, the older senior, who was more of the runner, and they worked them both in, even though Shane Buechele was actually the better passer and probably the better quarterback. That's what this reminds me of. We'll see if it develops that way. I don't have any inside information, but that would be my projection.
Ryan Cantor from Shaking the Southland, taking your comments and questions. We'll pass those along, but we're focusing on wide receivers, tight ends, and running backs. And unfair to Kelly Bryant is, of course, the direct comparison to Deshaun Watson, who, if you really look at the entire narrative, the statistics, plus the winning and the clutch situations in which he pulled his team through and even carry them on his back in some occasions, looking at the first Alabama championship game, we're talking about one of the top 5 quarterbacks in recent college football history. It's just outstanding what he accomplished. And Kelly Bryant, to make that comparison, when he had a lot of less support against Alabama in particular, and looking pretty subpar in the playoff game last year, and in a passing offense that, as you well know, Ryan, ranked 7th in the nation. If you just go by pure yardage, which I don't buy into because doesn't take into account efficiency, but just to give a measurement, 7th in the nation under Deshaun Watson the previous season at 335 yards per game. That dropped to 236 per game, which was 61st in college football. Okay, we got the wide receivers taken care of. Now we look at the tight ends, and certainly less of a factor in the offense last season. What do we see coming back for 2018?
So Garrett Williams was likely going to start last year, but he tore his ACL. And Mylan Richard, who was a redshirt junior last year, stepped up and did a solid job. But Clemson's had some really good tight ends over the years. Dwayne Allen comes to mind. It's been a key part of Clemson's offense. Jordan Leggett was obviously a huge piece in the national championship winning team, making a tremendous catch in the game-winning drive. But last year was their least productive year in terms of both receptions and yardage since 2008. They only had 25 receptions as a position group for only 348 yards, 210 of those yards going to Mylan Richard. In the latest depth chart, Garrett Williams and Mylan Richard are listed as or, so they're kind of co-starters in the moment. I think tight end is maybe an area where we'll see more improvement than any other. Mylan Richard, with another year, full year of starting experience, should get better. And if he doesn't, you have Garrett Williams, who's a good blocker, and I think can be a solid pass catcher. Clemson's offense really needs the tight ends to be productive, both in pass catching and blocking. I think they have a chance to really improve with Garrett Williams coming back in a full year of starter experience for Mylan Richard.
Yeah, tons of seniors there with not a whole lot of experience, but experience in the offense, experience with their teammates, and with the scheme there at Clemson. Again, a passing offense that took a step back because of the departure, first and foremost, of Deshaun Watson, and the skill set of Kelly Bryant being more runner than passer, although I had big hopes for Kelly Bryant. After watching the Louisville game early in the season, I thought he was able to deliver downfield, on target, take some real risk throws downfield and make those throws. So I expected a little bit more progression out of him than what we saw late in the season. But again, when you've got a defensive line in particular and the skill position people that they've got on offense and the market talent advantage over their opponents, you can understand the conservatism. So running backs. So the talent continues to grow, Ryan. I do believe that Wayne Gallman was missed against Alabama. Not that that would have made a difference, but he was just a guy that could muscle it up. And they had two, I don't want to call them scat backs because that isolates them to a particular role. And I think they're better than that, but just a little less bulk and muscle inside last year in favor of speed.
Yeah, and they're not scatbacks, but your point's well taken. They certainly didn't block Alabama's elite pass rush like Wayne Gallman did in the previous matchups. So Travis Etienne and Tavian Feaster are those two guys, and they each received 107 carries on the season last year, with Etienne getting more and more per game as the year progressed. Etienne averaged 7.2 yards per carry, which is fantastic. Feaster averaged 6.3, which is also very, very good. Interestingly, true sophomore Etienne is listed as the starter in the spring depth chart, with Adam Choice and Tavian Feaster listed as the second stringers. Choice was solid. He had 67 carries last year, getting almost 5 yards per carry. He's a good, solid back. You saw him play some in the Alabama game, likely for pass blocking. I don't know if this is a motivational thing for Tavian Feaster. It seems like Clemson fans are a little low on him right now. He's very good. He had a huge run against NC State that helped us win that game, and which was the difference in winning the Atlantic and winning the ACC and going back to the playoff. So I think between those three players, you have three really good running backs. With Fuller transferring, you don't have much depth behind them, but if they stay healthy, you have three really solid running backs who all can contribute and kind of share the load. They just need to improve in pass blocking, particularly Etienne and Feaster.
And I've got to think that that's something that certainly can be improved on. There were a number of times that they missed assignments, but other times they were overpowered. So that's a combination of film work and work on the practice field versus work in the weight room, but their frame can only stay where it is. So I would think that they're not going to become elite pass blockers, but at least give that split second of time further for a Kelly Bryant to get something going downfield. Did you mention Lynn Jay Dixon? He's a 4-star. I guess that he's not going to play, but the recruiting's been good there as it has been all over the field.
Yeah, and from what I hear about him, he's more of a scat back. I don't know if the plan is to redshirt him. I imagine if they stay healthy, they'd like to do that, but with only 3 scholarship running backs in front of him, I don't know if he'll end up playing. It was the same discussion we had with Travis Etienne last year. Would they redshirt him, and then he ends up being the starter by the end of the year and is starting this year. So I don't know what the plans are with Lynn Jay Dixon. We'll have to see.
So don't see necessarily a ton of stuff on the chat, a lot of comments here, but just kind of repeating what you're talking about in regards to people's favorite wide receivers, skill position players, running backs. Choice is somebody that a few fans are relying on to provide a little bit of muscle and short yardage situation.
Let me add a comment about the wide receivers. So behind Hunter Renfro at the slot, you have TJ Chase and Will Sweeney, the coach's son. They have a combined 50 yards last year, which makes me think that guys like Cornell Powell or Trevion Thompson, especially with T. Higgins at the 9 position, could be moving around to different wide receiver positions. I could see Trevion Thompson, a redshirt senior, cross-training at all the different wide receiver positions, whether it's slot, the 2, even the 9, or he's listed as 9, so including the 9, to get his snaps. I really want to see Trevion Thompson have a big year. He's kind of one of the guys I'm really rooting for. T. Higgins is the guy that I think is going to end up being the breakout player for Clemson this year.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and actually spotlighted T. Higgins to a certain extent based on some of your coverage and a few other tidbits that I picked up to tag T. Higgins exactly with that typical breakout player status for the offseason. Thompson caught 11 last year for 94 yards. Cornell Powell, 8 for 57 for Clemson's wide receiver core coming back. So I've got a huge Miami contingent, Ryan, on the line as well. They love to talk trash, even in a situation here where there's little trash to be throwing around, considering 38-3 and 58-0, if you want to go back that far. I would think that based on last year's results and the performance on the field by both teams leading up to the game and taking the entire narrative and season performance into account, of course, if they line up 10 times, it's not going to be 38-3 each and every time. Clemson wouldn't beat Wake Forest by 35 points on average if they played 10 times, but they only met once, and it was a complete annihilation. There was a missed throw by Malik Rozier early in the game that could have kept Miami in it, put some points on the board, but Clemson dominated along the defensive front, most notably was the huge difference. Offensive line for Miami versus D-line for Clemson. But I got to think that Clemson's still a 2-touchdown better team entering 2018.
Yeah, I would certainly think so. I do think Miami's on the way up. It's hard to tell if they peaked in their game against Notre Dame, and that's kind of the apex of the Mark Richt era there. At Georgia, Mark Richt had a ton of success early and then kind of plateaued. They lost a lot on their defensive line with their linebackers. Their secondary is still really good. I believe his name is Jaquan Johnson, the safety. Excellent player. So I think Miami and Virginia Tech are going to battle again for the Coastal. I think they're going to be competitive. I don't necessarily think we're going to, beat them by 35 again. If they continue the trend of, cutting the gap by 20 some odd points each time, it'll be close this time. I think they're a solid team. We may see them back in the ACC championship. I know the Miami faithful love Mark Rogers.
Yeah, for some reason they've made their way over here. I think we can we can thank in part one of your colleagues over there at SB Nation, Cam Underwood, for bringing a lot of folks over here. But in looking at that division, I think it's clear that Miami's on a tier by themselves based on talent that's finally come through to win the Coastal Division. I would put Virginia Tech on the next plane with a shot, especially playing Miami at home, of winning that division. And then the rest of it's muddled as it typically is. And for a long time, the entire division practically was muddled with a group of possible contenders. But looking at your division, just the early forecast in regards to who could possibly jump out and challenge Clemson. Florida State, of course, comes to mind, but they have their issues. And with a first-year head coach, that's sometimes difficult to make that statement and that move against an elite program. NC State obviously loses the entire defensive line that was elite, and but brings back maybe the best quarterback in the conference in Ryan Finley.
I like Ryan Finley a lot. I think he's a really good quarterback. They lost a ton of talent. I mean, people don't talk about it, but they won. I think they went 9-4 last year. But that was one of their most talented teams, really, in program history. They lost a ton, not just off the defensive line, but off the offensive line. That offensive line was unbelievable. I was shocked at how well they did against Clemson's very good defensive line. That was incredibly impressive. I think they kind of missed their shot. With Clemson and Florida, especially Florida State, being as down as they were, and Clemson going to Raleigh last year, I think they'll be hard-pressed to come to Clemson and win. I know they're already double-digit underdogs. I think I saw it was 19 or 20-point dogs already that just came out from Vegas. I think Florida State is still the number one contender with Clemson in the Atlantic. They're just more talented than the rest of the competition. And I think Willie Taggart's a good coach. I think it may take a while. And I kind of like James Blackman as the starter over DeAndre Francois, who had some offseason trouble and a couple different things. But I think in the next couple of years, Florida State and Clemson will be back to battling, huge heavyweight battles, top 10 matchups. And I think this year going to Tallahassee is going to be really tough.
I think the division top to bottom ranks a little bit lower with a lot of people than it should. I have it ranked higher. The SEC West, I believe, is the best 1 through 7. I think the Big Ten East is the best if you just look at the top half with Ohio State, Michigan, Michigan State, Penn State. But man, this division is difficult. Throw out Syracuse, and they're not awful. They're not bottom of the league awful like some of the other Power 5 conferences have in Kansas or Oregon State or somebody like that. So they obviously put up a fight against Miami, beat Clemson. So they're not awful Syracuse. But the rest of the division, we're talking about postseason teams. We're talking about BC coming back last year, playing well with one of the best running backs in the nation in A.J. Dillon. You mentioned NC State, which is typically an 8-win type program. That I agree, they missed their window with the home game, the defensive line play, Ryan Finley, and the 2 weapons they lost at wide receiver and running back coming into 2018. Florida State's got an elite program that just took the one shot against Alabama, lost their quarterback, and it all came unraveled. I would expect even against a very difficult schedule, they get back to the 8-win range at least in year 1 under Willie Taggart, and even programs like Wake Forest. And of course, Louisville's been good, but Wake Forest has made the division stronger from top to bottom, becoming a major player in fringe top 25 type program, winning a bowl game against an SEC Western Division foe. So it's an extremely difficult divisions suddenly, and not necessarily programs that are going to challenge Clemson, but programs that are going to make the division very respectable and account for itself outside the division against other leagues.
Yeah, Dave Clawson's done a really good job at Wake Forest. I think he's a very good coach, and if they can keep him around in Winston-Salem for a long time, they'll be in good shape. I think they'll take a step back this year. They lost some pretty notable talent for them. They had a senior, a 4-year starter at quarterback that they lose, Wolford, who was very good, really underrated, and also an elite defensive end. Pretty big losses for them. I think Boston College could be very competitive in the Atlantic Division. One thing you said I wanted to ask you about, I think that the Big Ten East is really good, because even after those 4, you still have Maryland, and they're not bad. I mean, Rutgers is bad, but I think that division's better than the SEC West, especially once you get past the schools from Alabama.
Yeah, the top is no question. Those 4 teams are top 15 teams, and 3 of them most likely in the top 10 in the country. Maryland has recruited top 15 to 25 classes the last 2 years, so it's going to be interesting to see if they can develop those kids. They were pretty bad last year. They had the Texas Statement game 1, then they went 4-8, and Indiana's not been horrible. So yeah, it could be challenged, and certainly people put more weight on the top half of a division and not caring about what happens elsewhere. So if you take that approach, it would be the best division in college football. But looking at 1 through 7, I just don't think that there's many weak spots in the West. I would still go West over Big Ten East myself.
No doubt those are the 2 best divisions, though.
Yeah, but just surveying it, I would go with the Atlantic there in the ACC next. And speaking of which, I've looked at schedules recently, so I'm going to do a ranking of the Power 5 schedules, as I typically do in the summer, from 68 all the way up to number 1. What I love about the ACC scheduling is, number 1, you've got the Notre Dame factor that makes it difficult for 5 teams each and every year that have to schedule Notre Dame. In addition to that, you've got the 4 schools in the ACC that have the rivalries with the SEC East, so they have the built-in Power 5 game. And what's resulted is a very difficult doubling up of Power 5 games for a number of teams in the ACC. For example, this year, Florida State has to deal with Notre Dame and Florida. And even with Clemson going out and scheduling Texas A&M, they have to deal with 2 not top-level teams across the country, but fringe top 25 teams in Texas A&M and South Carolina. So this isn't just in the ACC. This is across the country, where it was nice to see 1 Power 5 game out of 3 or 4 non-conference opponents. We now see probably 3/4 in looking at the future schedules, 3/4 of Power 5 teams scheduling 2 Power 5 opponents in the non-conference. And for Clemson and a number of teams in the ACC, it's almost forced upon them based on the Notre Dame factor and the rivalries with the SEC Eastern Division.
Yeah, and that's been one of the great things. I'm so happy and thankful that we got Notre Dame to partially join the ACC, because what it's done is it's really prevented us from the ACC from going to 9 conference games, because it's just not realistic when you look at, Clemson has to play South Carolina, and every couple of years they're playing Notre Dame. If neither of those count, and they have to play 9 other ACC games, you've taken up almost the entire schedule. And so that's why we haven't gone to 9 conference games, which is great, because now we get to go play Auburn. That's an awesome road trip. College Station, that's going to be a great time. And those road trips and those contests are a lot more fun than playing Duke or playing Pittsburgh or playing whoever from the Coastal this extra team in the 9th game is going to be. And Miami's another team that's scheduled, has an interesting schedule this year. They don't have a built-in non-conference rival, because their built-in rival is Florida State, and Florida, I don't think Florida likes playing them too much. But they play LSU this year, and that's going to be a really interesting early season game.
The issue I do have with ACC scheduling, and it's no different in some of the other conferences, other than the 9-game seasons in the Pac-12 and the Big Ten eliminate this to a certain extent, is that it just leaves for unbalanced, inequitable scheduling across the board. So I did a video a few weeks ago where I analyzed the ACC schedules, and they're bound by the commitment of playing the rival in the other division. So for Clemson, that's Georgia Tech. And some of those make sense. We want to see Miami play Florida State. to a lesser extent, although it's not known outside the conference very much, Clemson, Georgia Tech have a rivalry that those two schools, from what I know, want to keep that intact. And North Carolina and North Carolina State makes sense. The rest of them are just kind of fill-ins. But what it does is when you play an 8-game conference season and you play everyone in your division, so you're only talking about 2 other games, and one is scheduled each and every year as a designated rival, it makes for a very imbalanced schedule where, for example, I think Florida State or Miami have to play like a 12-4 combined record from the other division, and they have rivals in their own division that play 2 teams that went 4-12. So when you're competing for a division championship against 2 teams or against a team that plays an 8-game lesser composite record than you do, I just don't think it's fair.
And it's certainly not. I mean, you're totally right. And it was not last season, but the season before. I picked Virginia Tech, and I don't think they were quite the in vogue pick that year, if I remember, from the Coastal, but it wasn't even that they were the best. I just looked at the schedule, and everyone else was playing Clemson or Florida State, and they had a cakewalk. I think it was like Wake Forest and Boston College or something like that. No disrespect to those schools, but if Miami has to play Florida State, and I think it was Georgia Tech has Clemson, I mean, you're getting a freebie pick there. It's a free win. So relatively speaking, that is. So yeah, it's totally unfair, but you can have that, or you can have Clemson play Duke Duke and UNC and Virginia in 3 years in a row instead of Texas A&M or Auburn or Georgia. I'd rather it be unfair but fun than fair and boring. So.
I bring equity to the analysis, and that's always my main contribution here. I think on my channel, at least from my own personal analysis, is trying to bring some a common perspective and equity to college football. So that's one of my big aims, and I take that approach to scheduling. But I definitely, yes, would rather watch, in terms of turning on a television, I'm going to do that more so for Clemson and Texas A&M or Auburn versus Clemson taking on Duke or Virginia. No question about that. That cannot be argued. All right, got Ryan Cantor from Shaking the Southland on the line. He is eagerly anticipating Clemson's draw in the baseball regionals. And we appreciate him stopping by to run down position groups, as is our aim with the major programs, to look at each and every position as we head toward August camp, and also taking your comments and questions. So, Ryan, we appreciate you stopping by.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.